news of the moment.
Talk Radio.
Now available on TV.
Welcome back. Time now to talk about a couple of issues. One, Macron and Merkel in trouble over their trashing of the AstraZeneca jab. And two, the pressing issue of the cost of living, the rising cost of living, could plunge 4.7 million Brits into poverty. Let's talk to the head of Young Voices UK, political commentator Jason Reed. Good evening, Jason.
Good evening, Kevin.
First up, let's talk about Emmanuel Macron and Angela Merkel when she was still German Chancellor, of course. Macron's still in the job, unfortunately. Now, you remember, was it a couple of years ago now, or 18 months ago or so, when the AstraZeneca jab came out, the British AstraZeneca jab came out, both of those European leaders trashed it, saying it may be only of marginal use. They basically put a real question mark over it. And now Sir John Bell, who was at the time a government advisor on the COVID crisis, he's an Oxford University professor in medicine, he says that this trashing of the AstraZeneca vaccination by Merkel and Macron is almost certainly responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths. That's quite an accusation, isn't it?
It is, and Macron and Merkel need to think very, very carefully about what they said and what the consequences might have been. It seems pretty obvious in hindsight, and to be honest, it seemed pretty obvious at the time as well, that they were not really motivated by the concern for the safety and health of their citizens when they were trashing the AstraZeneca jab, because they were very happy to promote other vaccines. It wasn't an issue with the vaccines. It was just that they didn't like the AstraZeneca one. It was singled out. And the only thing it seems to mark it out in that way is that it's British. As you say, it was developed in part by the University of Oxford. And so it seems pretty clear that this is motivated in large part by a lot of Brexit bitterness, by a lot of just wanting to make life as difficult as possible for Britain, and especially in France, when there's an election coming up later this year for President Macron. He's resorted to the oldest trick in the book, which is picking on the British and picking a fight with the British, and on various other issues as well, of course, not just on vaccines, on the migrant crisis, on the fishing disputes and so on. He just wants to pander to his people, and he thinks he's doing that by villainising the British and making us out to be the most evil country in the world. And the result of that, it seems, according to Professor Bell, is that this has resulted in a lot of deaths because people were unsure about the AstraZeneca vaccine for reasons that turned out to be quite unscientific and false in a lot of cases.
Yes, Macron said that there was very little information available for the vaccine, and he described it as quasi-ineffective for people over 65. And Merkel went on to say that it was only 6.5% effective for that age group, which, by the way, she was in. Now, she later had to eat humble pie because actually it was particularly effective for people over 65. So these were utter untruths that they both came out with. And Merkel, to be fair to her, well, I don't want to be that fair, but she did eat humble pie by publicly having the AstraZeneca vaccine and sort of saying I was wrong. But by then, according to John Bell, the professor, Regis medicine professor at Oxford University, at that point, a very senior advisor to the government on the crisis, by then, hundreds of thousands of people were probably doomed to death. It's extraordinary, isn't it?
It is extraordinary. There were lots of other countries that followed in France and Germany's footsteps when the Macron and Merkel said these things, others across Europe like Sweden and Denmark and various other countries in the developing world, especially in Africa as well. So there's a huge number of people who would have been affected by this because they were following what Macron and Merkel were saying. And so their words had a huge damaging effect. I'm old enough to remember the start of the pandemic when we were told that Brexit was going to cause a lot of deaths in this country because we weren't part of the EU's magnificent vaccine scheme, and so we weren't going to have access to the vaccines. And of course, it turned out to be exactly the opposite. We were able to roll out vaccines at one of the fastest rates in the world in this country, while lots and lots of European countries, including France and Germany, lagged behind because they couldn't get their hands on enough doses because they hadn't put their bids in early enough. And that, of course, resulted then in the European Union trying to sue AstraZeneca for not giving it enough vaccine doses quickly enough. Of course, it ended up losing that case. This is despite the fact that AstraZeneca were the only major vaccine company to produce the vaccine and sell it at cost. So while the Americans like Pfizer and Moderna were raking in the profits, AstraZeneca did not make a single penny on the vaccine, and yet they were sued, they were attacked, they were villainized by the European Union, by the French government, by the German government, by countless others, which provides a huge disincentive for what they were doing. That means if there's a future pandemic, if there are future diseases, that AstraZeneca or various other British companies, they might think, well, why should I develop a vaccine or develop any medicine or do anything to help if this is the way we're going to be treated?
And of course, our friend, the European Commissioner, the President Ursula von der Leyen, the lady who rose without trace to become the most powerful person in Europe, she accused us of cutting, or the UK, of cutting corners on safety. All of this was quite clearly pure Brexit bitterness on the part of Europeans who were furious that we'd left their club, and they're also furious that our vaccine rollout was going great guns while theirs was a tragic disaster. So it's outrageous. It's absolutely outrageous, and I don't think world leaders should get away with this kind of behaviour. I hope that the chickens come home to roost for these people, because this was beyond politics. It was dangerous. Now let's move on. Talking about dangerous, let's talk about the cost of living, which is spiralling dangerously high, something you wanted to talk about. Report in the Financial Times suggesting that as these prices spiral, as costs spiral, 4.7 million Brits will be left literally struggling to feed themselves.
Yeah, there's more and more cases are coming to light of families having to choose literally between heating their homes and feeding their children. And there are only going to be more and more cases like this over the next few months as the situation gets worse and worse, especially as food prices continue to go up. And so it's absolutely absurd that we've got the government at the moment, this week in fact, trying to push through its health and care bill with all these new anti-obesity regulations. They're going to ban online junk food advertising. There's a new watershed coming in to ban advertising what it deems to be unhealthy food after 9 p.m. on TV. They're trying to crack down on buy one, get one free offers and 3 for 2 and other promotional offers in supermarkets, because they think that that is the reason that obesity is going up in this country, because people can't help themselves when they see a 3 for 2 on crisps. And so by banning them, you'll make British people thinner. Of course, that's not the case. And all it will do is make the cost of living crisis worse. There's some analysis from the Food and Drink Federation, which predicts that these regulations alone could add £160 a year to the shopping bills of the poorest families. There are lots of families who rely on those special offers, who rely on buy one, get one free and so on, in order to make ends meet, in order to be able to pay for their families shopping that week. And the government obviously hasn't thought of that. The government apparently hasn't noticed that there's a cost of living crisis going on and that it's only going to get worse, because they're clinging on to this simplistic worldview that you can just crack down on so-called unhealthy foods and so eliminate obesity that way. It doesn't work. It's never worked. And all it will do is create a whole host of new problems for the families who are struggling most of all.
Yeah, I mean, the food situation for millions of people will be a lot more fundamental than whether or not the food they buy or are able to afford will perhaps make them slightly obese. That isn't the problem. I mean, while this escalating crisis gets worse by the day and will get terribly bad in the months to come, we can rest assured that the government's planning to put calorie warnings on menus in restaurants. Why are they getting their priorities so wrong at the moment?
I'm afraid the problem comes from the very top with Boris Johnson, who, of course, linking back to COVID, he caught COVID and he puts down the fact that he got so ill with COVID to the fact that he was overweight. And so he lost some weight, which is good for him. But now he thinks that the rest of us need all this intrusive nanny state regulation in order to lose weight, and that you and I are just crying out for someone to put a big red flashing label on a chocolate bar to tell us that it's got sugar in it, because otherwise we're completely hopeless. That's not the case at all. We're not stupid. We're not children. We don't need to be talked down to. We know exactly what is in food and we know exactly what we're buying when we buy it. And if certain families choose to buy certain things because they're cheaper, even if they're unhealthier, that means there's a cost of living crisis. It doesn't mean you then crack down on the cheaper food and try to tax sugar to make it more expensive and less accessible, or try to ban the advertising, or try to restrict access, or try to ban promotional offers. That's never worked, and it will never work. This kind of nanny state narrative just comes from a place of classism, I think, and of a general patronizing attitude towards people in this country, that they need this kind of help when they don't. What they need is support to get through the cost of living crisis, not new advertising restrictions on unhealthy foods.
Yeah, there's a fear, a suspicion in the air that this government, Boris and his gang, just don't really conceive of the terrible train hurtling down the track that is the cost of living crisis. It is going to be terrible in the months to come, isn't it?
It is. Food prices are already going up for a number of reasons. Gas prices, of course, affect manufacturers and distributors. A lot of the increases in food prices in recent years have been absorbed by the industry. The producers have been able to keep costs low themselves by absorbing those costs. But all of that is coming to a head now. We've had supply chain issues. We've had, of course, lingering effects from the pandemic. And so the Tesco chairman, John Allen, did an interview over the weekend where he said this is only going to get much, much worse. And he talked about how disturbed he was by stories of families having to choose between heating and food. But it's all very well saying that we're disturbed, but we need the government now to do something about it. I think you're absolutely right. They don't understand, for some reason, the scale of the problem that we are heading towards. There seems to be a bit of a complacency, and we've got that policy about a £200 loan on energy bills, which is just kicking the can down the road and which won't solve any problems. That will not keep any families from having this horrible predicament of having to choose between heating and food.
Yeah, well, they're saying that the average family over the next few months, that their annual bills, including a £700 energy price hike, but the average total hike in family expenses are going to go up by nearly £3,000. And trust me, there are many, many, many households that literally cannot afford that. The prospect is extremely grim. Great to talk to you, Jason. As always, we'll do it again same time next week. That's Jason Reed, head of Young Voices UK, and increasingly very fine political commentator.